Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to the EduSite Network. Our topic of discussion today is part of our series on political theories, and the specific theory for today is the theory of sovereignty. And for this very lecture and discussion, we have with us in our studio Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. With this brief introduction, we welcome him and also request him to begin our today's lecture. Thank you for coming, sir.
Thank you, Survashi. Today's discussion we are going to have on the theory and the concept of sovereignty, how it has evolved, what are the different features, and how this is being debated today, because this is becoming very important theme in political theory in light of certain developments which have taken place in last 2-3 decades, particularly this phenomenon called globalization and so on and so forth, where this sovereignty of the nation state seems to have been constrained from outside, particularly from the global forces. So, we will be taking into account all these factors, and along with that there is also a trend of regional solidarities, or what is called in international politics regionalism, neo-regionalism, where you have the nation states are becoming some sort of subservient to the regional bodies or regional formations like European Union or for example Southeast Asian Association for Regional Cooperation and so on and so forth. So, how this entire concept of sovereignty as it is basically available in political theory can be harmonize with new development. That is some one important issue today in front of the entire social science and the academia. But along with that there is also a new dimension emerging in light of the new democratic upsurge which one can find all over the world, and that is largely on account of the challenge which is being thrown by the people's power to the state authority. So, what is known as a civil society agencies or civil society activism in today's world, and the way this activism is leading to a situation where the authority or the absolute power of the nation state or the state is questioned off and on, and that questioning is largely on account of the fact that it is not in democracy, it is not advisable, or it is not possible that a state should claim a full authority or a full sovereignty on the citizens and on policy making, or the legal, it cannot be the sole custodian of law, or it cannot be the sole basis of the enunciation, or for that matter the origin of law. So, all these things are adding new dimension to this entire debate which is basically materializing around this concept of sovereignty. But before we come to these issues which we find today emerging on account of the expansion and deepening of democracy, on account of certain changes in the political economy in the world, particularly the new developments in technology, new developments through which the market is being imagined and visualized, and the entire world acquiring a new form, a new shape, and it is being presented as a global village, or it is called a globalized world. So, these things are important, but nonetheless we have to first of all look at this entire concept of sovereignty, that how it has evolved, and particularly in modern time how it has acquired a definitive meaning, and what was the context. That is very important, because of course the concept of state authority or state power has always been there. In fact, even ancient times we have had number of instances and examples when a state authority was present even in India or even in Western world and some other civilizational context, one can say the presence of some state authority. But what has happened that the way this state authority has been defined, the way it has been located, the way it has been basically presented, that is something totally modern. And this modern context of this evolution of this entire discourse of sovereignty has a very important anchoring in some of the socio-economic developments which took place after 15th or 16th century in Europe, that is the rise of capitalism and the new developments in political arena and the rise of absolute state or absolutism, and the fight which went on between the church and the state, and the way this absolutism of the king or the monarch was legitimized and justifies, how it was legitimized in the sense that a separate sphere was sought to be carved out for its operation, for its power, and that led to this entire conceptualization in political theory which is known as sovereignty. Now, the thing is that we have to basically look at all these dimensions, that how this has happened. But before that this concept, I mean this word, the terminology has a Latin origin, and it comes from superinus, which implies basically supreme. Now, so far as this entire concept is concerned, of course different thinkers in the Western world, political thinkers have played important role, but in fact Baudin, French thinker Baudin perhaps played most important role, and he is credited with the fact that he was the first person who provided a very systematic doctrine of this concept of sovereignty much before others started talking. But of course, it was a systematic formulation, but nonetheless it was not in the same sense in which it was later refined, fine tuned and presented by subsequent scholars and the thinkers who are considered pioneers so far as this entire concept of sovereignty is concerned. For example, Austin. We will come to this thing later, which is basically believed or which is considered as a legal jurisprudence or a kind of positivist school and their contribution on the evolution of this concept. But I think this the Baudin therefore should be credited with this systematic basically systematic exposition of this concept so far as political theory is concerned. Now, before we move on to the different meanings in the different types, different features and its history, we should first of all also we should have a look at the characteristics of this this entire concept of sovereignty as it is normally understood. What are different characteristics, the way it is basically conceptualized and the way it is visualized. Now, if we look at the characteristics, then the first important characteristic is considered to be the fact that it is absolute, that there is no restraint on it, totally it is unrestrained power or authority. So, therefore, this absoluteness is perhaps one of the important characteristic of this concept, and therefore, this absoluteness is basically associated with some of the thinkers who came later. For example, Hobbes was one such example, and perhaps the most profound and the systematic exposition as we find in the works of Austin. So, therefore, this absoluteness, that it is totally unchecked, basically unchecked and uncontrolled power of the authority, which may be one person, which may be a group of person, but nonetheless it is absolute in nature. The second characteristic is the universality, that it has to be universal, it cannot be particular. Therefore, this authority which is absolute is also universal in nature. So, I mean this range of its operation, in fact its sweep, or one can say that its the zone of operation is basically universal in nature. And therefore, the third characteristic related to this the earlier two is that it is inalienable. that it cannot be alienated, that it cannot be shared, it cannot be parted with, that in fact one of the important thinkers of political theory and political thought, he said that the moment you divide it, that means you destroy it. So, I mean divisibility of sovereignty means that destruction of this entire concept. So, therefore, it is inalienable, you cannot alienate, you cannot transfer, and therefore, basically this non-transference is very important fact of this entire concept, and therefore, Rousseau is at times cited in support of this argument, because Rousseau's famous statement that power can be transferred, not will, and he basically associated sovereignty with will, not power. So, the legitimacy aspect is very prominent in Rousseau. We will come to this issue later, but what I am trying to basically put forth here, that this inalienability is also one of the important characteristics of this entire concept called sovereignty. So, apart from this inalienability, there is another factor, and that is called permanence, that it is permanent, it is not temporary phenomenon. So, once this concept emerges, once the state authority acquires that sovereignty vis-a-vis citizens, both in internal and external matters, so it becomes permanent, and this permanence can be destroyed only if the entire state authority is destructed. So, therefore, what happens, that the permanence is another important characteristic of this concept. And finally, this indivisibility, that it cannot be divided into different parts, and therefore, in fact one of the attacks, powerful attacks on this concept which has come in over the years, particularly from a school of thought which is called pluralism. We will refer to it later, but the thing is that these pluralists basically object to precisely this fact, that in modern times, in a democratic societies, this claim that this is totally indivisible, I mean this is, the indivisibility is one of the characteristic of this concept, is unsustainable, because no society, no state system can survive without basically sharing its authority, its legitimacy, its power, and therefore its sovereignty with number of organizations and associations within the territory, which perhaps sometimes complement, supplement the functioning of a state authority and state power, and therefore, this division of authority is perhaps one of the important characteristic of our times, particularly in the time when democracy is a very dominant ideology. So, therefore, this divisibility is perhaps supported by the pluralists and some others who basically argue from the point of view of democratic decentralization, democratic division of power, and particularly in light of the growing popularity of the federal systems all over the world, this argument in fact acquires new legitimacy and new meaning. But this, so far as the proponents of this concept of sovereignty is concerned, they basically hold their ground and they say that neither it is alienable nor it is divisible, because the moment you divide it, that means you are going to destroy it. So, therefore, these are some of the important characteristics through which scholars have tried to identify this concept in political theory, and these characteristics are considered to be the core principles, the core features, the core values of this entire concept. So, after looking at these characteristics, we have to basically also take into account the different meanings of this concept, that how this entire thing has been understood from different point of view. I mean, what are the different meanings which one gets, particularly when we talk of this concept sovereignty. For example, in different contexts, of course, it has different meanings, but two things are very important. One is that at times we hear about a concept called titular sovereign or the titular sovereignty. What does it mean? Now, this titular or actual, I mean this differentiation is largely on account of the fact that the titular sovereign is the sovereign which basically is powerful or which commands authority only for namesake, but in practice someone else or a body or a or agency wields power in his or her name, and therefore is just a symbolic head or symbolic authority lies with this titular sovereign. Now, particularly in context of the constitutional monarchy of Britain, this term comes very frequently, that how the British monarch is a titular sovereign, is sovereign or is a sovereign only for namesake, but in actual practice it is basically the cabinet or the prime minister and his cabinet, or the parliament, the popular house, the lower house, they are the real wielder of power, and the monarch remains a titular head. So, therefore, this titular sovereignty is normally referred to this type of situation. The second the term which we often find or we often encounter is the legal sovereignty. Now, what is this legal sovereignty? Now, basically the legal means that a body or agency or an individual, or one can say, but in democratic context normally it is referred to as bodies like parliament or for example law making bodies. Then the supreme law making body within the state is considered a legal sovereign. So, therefore, who is this law making body? Now, as we know, in democracy normally all laws are framed by parliament, the legislatures, and therefore, it is referred as legally sovereign. That who is sovereign in society, who is sovereign within the state? Basically, it is not the one which executes it, it is not one which implements it, but one which basically frames it, and who has the authority to frame this law. So, it is at times referred as in democracy it is the legislature which frames the law. So, therefore, legal sovereignty lies with the legislature. So, this concept of legal sovereignty therefore is referred to the body which basically frames law, which basically makes law. The related thing which we often hear is the concept of political sovereignty, that along with legal sovereignty there is a concept of political sovereignty. Now, who is politically sovereign? Now, in democracy particularly it is argued that there are bodies which frame laws, but those bodies are the symbolic bodies, but the actual will behind that body lies elsewhere, and actual strength of those bodies basically lies elsewhere, and that lies with the people who basically create those bodies, law making bodies. For example, legislature is there, the members are there, but who are the members? Members are basically elected by the people, the voters, the citizens, and therefore, it is the electorates who are the real sovereign, the political sovereign. Basically, the reign of politics, the power, reign of power lies in their hands. They control the entire thing, the state machinery, the state power, the law making bodies. Therefore, it is the political sovereignty that is perhaps crucial in a democracy. Now, what has happened that in this direct democracy, the participatory democracy as it is referred, this distinction between legal and political sovereignty totally collapses, because you do not have this type of distinction. It is only possible or available in representative or indirect democracy, where you have the people electing their representatives and they becoming the lawmakers, and they go in, they enter this law making bodies. So, you have the two different basically arenas, two different spheres, and that are identified, one can identify that this is the legal sovereign body and this is political sovereign body. But so far as the political sovereignty is concerned, one thing is also very clear, that it is totally indeterminate. It cannot be determined the way, it cannot be located the way the legal sovereignty can be located. Its place cannot be located. Who is ultimately this political sovereign? The citizens, or only the voters, or those who have voted for those who have got elected. So, therefore, it is slightly amorphous, it is indeterminate, that who ultimately can be called political sovereign in democracy. So, this is also a debatable question. Now, in recent years we have seen another debate basically surfacing in democracy, that is civil society versus the state. I mean this will versus the procedure. And now it is argued that it is the civil society which is basically ultimate site of political sovereignty, and all other powers and authorities have to submit to it, because it is basically will of the people. And even in Indian context it is referred that Indian constitution in the preamble itself basically proclaims that we the people of India. So, therefore, it is the people who are the sovereign, and these agencies, these institutions like parliament and other things are the creation of that will. So, basically if will of the people starts asserting, then every other institution and agency has to submit to it. So, I mean this debate is just snowballing into big issue, that whether democracy implies only will of the people, or democracy also implies the procedures, or democracy implies both procedures and will of the people. That is basically the entire framework of constitutionalism and democracy, that democracy in itself is basically mobocracy. So, therefore, it has to be limited, the limited government, that is constitutionalism, that is law, procedures and so on and so forth. So, I mean they have to exist in combination with each other, then only it can make sense, then only it can provide a orderly governance, then only it can add meaning to this entire concept called democracy. So, these issues are now becoming a very important debatable issue in political theory today, that ultimately this political sovereignty therefore is basically of course is indeterminate, but even if we have to locate, where to locate it, in civil society, in electoral arena, in the citizenship structure, or where. So, I mean this is one important issue of debate today. So, apart from this legal and political, the fourth term which we often hear is the popular sovereignty. Now, what is this popular sovereignty? And this is something which was popularized by political thinker Rousseau, and he basically popularized it through his entire concept of general will, the people's will, the general will of the society, and therefore, he said that it is the power of the people. Popular will is the power of the people, and we have basically we know that how in his through the social contract he tried to create a framework where basically the general will was the framer of the law, and general will was not the particular will of an individual, but a collective will, in which the personal interests were superseded or overcome by the public interest, the public good. So, public spirited will, one can say, this general will. So, therefore, this general will was to some extent in his thought was the popular sovereignty lay there. So, basically who is popular sovereign? Popular sovereign is basically the people's will, the general will, the collective will, not the particular or not the selfish will, but a public spirited will of the people. So, therefore, this popular sovereignty is something which is also associated with the entire concept of participatory or direct democracy, which is basically becoming quite popular these days due to certain deformities and certain problems which the representative democracy is encountering world over. So, that is another concept. And then you have also, you often hear a distinction which is often made between de jure sovereign and de facto sovereign. So, I mean we have to see that who is de jure and who is the de facto. Now, de jure sovereign normally refers to sovereign who is legally sovereign or occupant of the office or the wielder of authority and power. So, legally, not illegally, but legally, I mean he commands or she commands the legitimacy in the eyes of the people. So, that is the de jure, and the de facto is that the power behind this legal, I mean though legally someone or a body is basically sovereign, but behind that body there is some other force which wields power. So, de facto. So, de jure and de facto I mean distinction is made. So, one can say that de jure is the legal sovereign, whereas the de facto is the actual sovereign. So, legality and actuality, I mean this distinction is posited in terms of this thing. Now, one of the most important thinker so far as this concept of sovereignty is concerned, Austin, he in fact refuses to recognize this distinction between de jure and de facto. He said this distinction is totally unsustainable. I mean, there is nothing called actual and legal. Whatever, if there is a sovereign, he has or she has to be legal, or body is sovereign, it has to be legal. So, I mean, this actual thing or the legal thing, this distinction does not make much sense so far as Austin is concerned. So, therefore, we have seen that these are some of the the meanings through which meanings which this concept of sovereignty basically provides when we discuss or when we basically try to engage with this entire thing. Now, the thing is that before we turn to this this entire concept of sovereignty as it was propounded by Austin in his famous lectures on jurisprudence, that famous book, in fact how he defines it, what are the features of it, and how this has been criticized, we should also have a look at its history, the evolution. And one thing is very clear, that there was a time, particularly ancient time, the medieval time, when this the state of course even if it was there, but it shared its authority or its power or its sovereignty with number of associations and bodies in societies. And some of the associations, some of the bodies in societies commanded equal respect or commanded equal power. So, therefore, there was a sharing of this thing, but nonetheless the state was there. For example, in ancient time we have seen that number of associations in societies had lot of command or control over the people, and basically the laws which had its origin in customs, in tradition, the customary laws, and some of the kings even had to submit to those customary laws. So, therefore, that was a situation. Even the tribal societies, even if they had a nucleus of a state power, but nonetheless they were guided by number of customary laws and so on and so forth. So, what happened that its entire problem started only in modern times, and it was largely in context of the feudalism which had emerged in Europe in medieval times. And because of this rise of feudalism, this entire thing was basically the entire society was being governed by the church and the feudal lords. So, basically the Pope and the feudalism, the kind of alliance which we could see in medieval times, that led to the fragmentation of this entire thing. Now, what happened? The state authority. So, what happened that in this modern times, as it is normally referred, emerged with lot of upheavals, lot of turmoils, and those upheavals, those turbulences led to many many wars, and one of the most famous war was the 30 Years' War, which basically culminated into the Treaty of Westphalia, that is 1648, and it was the Treaty of Westphalia which is considered to be basically the basis of the emergence of modern nation state, because Treaty of Westphalia defined the 4 important elements of a state through which the modern nation state has been understood, imagined, and basically functions. For example, sovereignty, population, territory, and government. These 4 attributes of a state, which normally are considered to be important for the functioning, for the existence of modern nation state, were basically conceptualized in this Treaty of Westphalia, which came into existence after the 30 Years' War. Now, what happened that therefore, in 17th century, 16th century, you have a new context, the rise of capitalism. You have the emergence of a kind of a new class, what is called this merchant class, or the capitalist class, and therefore it required a more orderly social situation. It required a more powerful authority, or a more powerful state organization which could consolidate a fragmentary social order, which was the characteristic of the feudal age. So, therefore, it was a requirement of the time, and according to that requirement, what we find that number of revolutionary upheavals take place, because it was the aspiration of this new ascendant class, that is that was the bourgeoisie. And therefore, this modern era emerges in the West with this demand, and therefore with this promise that how to create a absolute state authority which can basically provide security, which can provide order, which can provide a meaningful life to the people. So therefore, what happens that this context basically translates into a number of philosophical theoretical churnings, and therefore, what we find happening in Western political thought is basically a reflection of those developments. And therefore, what we find that you have a Italian philosopher Machiavelli, who basically tried to revive this Roman concept of law, which basically believed in unlimited obedience of the people. So therefore, what happens that even Machiavelli is now trying to talk of this absolute state power, that how this state can bring order, or how the state can basically facilitate a more orderly governance, and so on and so forth. Now, what happens that therefore, what happens that in modern times, in keeping with these developments, you have number of philosophical and theoretical basically reflections on this issue. And one of the most important reflection we find coming from a British political thinker, in fact Thomas Hobbes, in his book Leviathan. Now, what Hobbes, in fact the context of Hobbes was of course the Civil War in England, and therefore what Hobbes does, that he basically comes up with an argument, basically the argument which is laced with number of suppositions, an argument which is basically grounded it on a number of theoretical basically premises, and one of the most important premises is entire discourse of social contract, that how people have entered into a contract, how they enter into contract to create a sovereign power. In his words is a Leviathan. It can be one or can be many, but a powerful absolute authority. Now, why people enter into contract? Because as he describes through his concept of a state of nature, that what was the state of nature, that how it was a state of warfare, how people did not know what were theirs and what were others. So, it was a cutthroat competition, people did not have any control on their life, and therefore, the security was one of the important concerns, and therefore, people decided to surrender some of their rights in order to get some security, some order, and that was basically the basis for this contract, that was the basis for the creation of the state authority and power. So, therefore, the absolute state authority is created, and the absolute state authority is created with the purpose of bringing security, with the purpose of providing liberty, because of course, this liberty is largely on account of the submission to this absolute power, because unless one submits it, otherwise there will be no liberty, because in a state of nature, as he describes, that liberty, absolute liberty meant basically no liberty, no one knew what was his or what was her. So, I mean that was the entire supposition, the entire premise on which he builds his entire argument of absolute power, absolute state, and so on and so forth. So, therefore, Hobbes totally removes all the limitations on this absoluteness or unlimited power of the sovereign. So, therefore, with Thomas Hobbes, what happens that you have the concept of sovereignty emerging in the sense we talked at the very beginning, that absoluteness, unlimitedness, and so on and so forth. So, some of the constraints which were imposed on this absolute unlimited power, that is called sovereignty, by French philosopher Baudin, in fact was removed by Hobbes, because Baudin in fact recognized that this absolute power would be basically subservient to the God, basically the law of the God, law of the nature. Even he was ready to even accept the control of the customs, that how the customs could checkmate this absolute power. But what happened in Hobbes, we find that he basically removes all the constraints on this absolute power of the sovereign. So, therefore, with Thomas Hobbes for the first time you have this entire concept of sovereignty in the modern sense, the way it is considered, the way it is conceptualized is emerging. Now, after Thomas Hobbes you have another important liberal political thinker, and he is John Locke. And what happens that in basically what Locke does, that he revisits and revises this entire concept of political absoluteness, which we find emerging in Hobbes. Now, first of all we have to basically understand one thing, that the context of Locke was different. It was a different basically Europe, it was a different context in which he was writing. Now, capitalism had basically was maturing, and the society had started moving towards a more orderly form, and therefore, the kind of basically anarchy which was the characteristic of the time in which Hobbes lived perhaps was not basically the feature of the society when Locke was writing. So, therefore, basically the entire issue which confronted Locke was different than what confronted Hobbes. So, Locke was now basically reflecting on this entire issue of consent, entire issue of representative government, the responsiveness, the limited government, on the liberty vis-a-vis the absolute power, and so on and so forth. So, therefore, this new aspiration, the democratic aspirations of the people, you find that now surfacing in a big way through this this Lockean writings. So, what Locke does, that he brings in that entire concept of consent, and therefore, the moment he brings in this entire concept of consent, therefore, this concept of representative government basically as a government which is basically circumscribed by basically he tries to circumscribe the state power through representative government, the consent, the popular will, and so on and so on, so on and so forth. So, what happens that in fact during the time of Locke, the same class, the merchant class, the bourgeoisie, who was basically looking for absolute power to provide them security, to provide them order, now had a different type of basically requirement, different type of aspiration. Now, it perhaps required more freedom and more autonomy, and therefore, this absolutism of the state had to be checkmated, and therefore, this was the requirement of the new class, the requirement of the time, and therefore, basically this new argument is now surfacing in form of this representative government, that how this freedom and autonomy of the people have to be preserved and protected. So, entire concept of the social contract, which we find that in Hobbes' writing basically moving in direction of the creation of absolute state authority and power, or a sovereign will. In fact, this entire concept of law as will of the sovereign, the command of the sovereign. Now, I mean this entire concept is basically now revised in the hands of Locke, and therefore, he brings in consent as an important factor of government. He brings in the legitimacy aspect, that how the government and the power can be legitimate in the eyes of the people. He brings in the entire concept of representative government, the limited government, the constitutional government, and therefore, this entire thing undergoes a massive change. The entire concept of sovereignty undergoes a massive change, and therefore, a lot of people see that in Locke you have the distinction between legal and political sovereignty. Now, he is basically differentiating the two, and he considers political sovereignty as more important than legal sovereignty, and political sovereignty is ultimately the people, the voters, the citizens who create those laws through their representative. So, this is how the context changes, and therefore, the argument also undergoes change. Then you have the Rousseau, the French philosopher Rousseau. Now, as we discussed earlier, very important contribution coming from him, and particularly through his entire concept of general will, and as we have seen that general will, the way he defines through his basically contract, that how a kind of true and legitimate state authority and power can be created. And then in that context, he says that it is a general will, that people should obey that will, because it is not something which is outside, this is basically is your own, basically you are obeying yourself. So, basically obedience to the law which prescribe to ourselves is basically I mean the general will, I mean basically you prescribe to yourself, you are not prescribing to others, or it is not being prescribed by others to you. So, I mean this is how he tries to come to this argument, and basically one thing is very important, that he does not make any distinction between state and community. I mean because it is through his writings that we find that also the basis for a participatory direct democracy is laid out. Now, therefore, in fact in the Rousseau's thought, the government becomes simply the tool. The real power, the real sovereign is the general will, that is the popular will, that is the people as a whole. In living in community. So, therefore, I mean in Rousseau's writings we find that a new context is emerging, and the context is different from the context of Hobbes and Locke, and the context is the context of the capitalism, or basically this new class entering a new phase in its evolution, in its history. So, this is how this entire concept has basically evolved in modern times within the political theory, or broadly one can say the liberal political discourse. Of course, there were others also who came in, for example, Bentham and others, basically the positivists, particularly so far as their contributions in law and jurisprudence, basically analytical school as it is referred, and their contributions are also very significant in the evolution of this entire concept. But one of the most important contribution came from what I mentioned earlier, Austin, particularly in his book the Lectures on Jurisprudence. Now, what Austin does, that he defines sovereignty in a manner which is considered perhaps more comprehensive, and one can say that a complete in terms of its major attributes, in terms of its major all important features, or the way basically it is operative in modern times. Now, Austin defines this sovereignty as if a determinate human superior, not in habit of obedience to a like superior, receives habitual obedience from a bulk of given society, that determinate human superior is sovereign in that society, and that society including that superior is society political and independent. So, therefore, this is his definition, that if a determinate human superior not in habit of obedience to a like superior and receives habitual obedience from a bulk of given society, that determinate human superior is sovereign, and in that society he is sovereign in that society, and the society including that superior basically is society both political and independent. So, therefore, this independence, the superiority, basically these things are contingent on these conditions which he lays down clearly in this definition. Now, what happens that in this definition of Austin, there are 4 or 5 things which emerges very clearly. The first, that there has to be determinate human superior. So, indeterminacy is ruled out. That first of all, if we are to understand this concept of sovereignty, then basically this superior, this human superior has to be determinate, its location has to be clearly basically demarcated. Number 2, basically what is law? Basically law in this definition is that nothing but command of the sovereign. So, law is the command of the sovereign, whatever the sovereign says is law, it is nothing to do with customs, traditions or anything else. So, only law can flow from this determinate superior. So, this is the command of the sovereign. The third thing is that this power is indivisible, you cannot divide it, that within a given territory there can be many determinate superior. No, in fact there has to be only one determinate superior. So, the power is indivisible, because the first part of this definition is that if a determinate human superior not in habit of obedience to a like superior, so there is no other superior above him. So, therefore, this power is totally indivisible. So, I mean whosoever wields this power, only he or she can wield it, others cannot share it, and basically the final attribute is, or final feature which emerges from this definition, is that a sovereign power is absolute. It cannot be constant from any side, either through customs or the traditions or the external forces or some international law and so on and so forth. So, the absoluteness is one of the important hallmark of this concept called sovereignty. So, all these features which we discussed in the very beginning as attributes of this concept, we find that they emerge from this definition provided by Austin, and therefore, Austin is considered to be the most profound proponent of this concept, and therefore, a analytical school, basically a proponent of analytical school, the positivists, and therefore, this Austinian theory is considered to be also a monistic theory of sovereignty, monism. That is basically this is, this entire concept of monistic theory basically originates from these premises. So, what happens that this Austinian definition of sovereignty has also met with many criticisms, and some of the things which we encounter today in today's world, I will come to those issues later, but one of the most celebrated criticism of this monistic concept of sovereignty, or the way it was propounded by thinkers like Austin, in fact was provided by a school of thought which is called political pluralism, the pluralists. And there were many pluralists in the West, particularly in Europe, and some of the famous pluralists were Maitland, basically Henry Mann, G.D.S. Cole, Sidney Webbs, Lindsay, Barker, and most importantly Lasky. So, these were the pluralists who basically challenged and questioned the entire premise of this monistic concept of sovereignty, and they believed that this entire premise is fallacious. It is totally basically unthinkable in today's context that the state power or a state authority or this sovereignty cannot be parted with, cannot be shared, it is not divisible or it is not alienable. All these premises have no basis either in history or in contemporary political events and situations. For example, the Maitland, one of the Henry Mann. Henry Mann's one of the important criticism of this entire monistic theory of sovereignty is basically based on a historical instance from India, and Henry Mann cites the case of Ranjit Singh, the king of Punjab, and he said that he basically issued commands the way Austin defines in its definition of sovereignty, but even Ranjit Singh had to submit to basically the force of customary laws. And customary laws, and he had to submit to the authority of tradition. So, therefore, even it cannot be justified or it cannot be verified on basis of certain historical instances, that even those absolute kings in history who issued commands in the same manner as perhaps Austin visualizes through his definition, but nonetheless they had to submit to both customs and traditions. So, this is one of the criticisms given by Henry Mann. Now, the Lasky, one of the most powerful critique of this entire monism or monistic theory of sovereignty, Lasky believes that in a democratic age it is totally basically unheard of, or it is not sustainable. This entire argument is not sustainable, that the state will not share its authority with any other organization or any other association or any other body. So, basically the pluralism or the pluralist school of thought argues that a state is one association among many associations which are available in society, and there are many associations which perform equally important role as a state does, and therefore, those associations and their their role, their contributions cannot be undermined, which perhaps is done by this entire monistic theory of sovereignty. So, this pluralistic this pluralism, political pluralism basically has gained ground over the years, particularly with the upsurge of democratic ideas and democratization of society, and particularly in light of the popularity of a form of government which is called federalism, which is perhaps a dominant political creed of modern times, particularly the way it has evolved since its beginning in United States of America after American War of Independence. In fact, many countries, I mean country after country has gone for this federalization of the federal form of government. Now, federalism is based on this principle of divisibility of power. The power is, or the sovereignty is divided between the two units of government, that is called the federation, the central government, and the units, that is the state governments. So, this divisibility is basically order of the day, or this is the principle on which the entire federal polity is based, and therefore, the critics, particularly the pluralists, argue that this is perhaps how the modern democracies function, and how this monistic theory would basically justify its argument vis-a-vis this new development, where in fact most of the societies are governed through these federal systems. So, this centralization, federalization, and so on and so forth are some of the instances or some of the examples which are cited by the critiques of this monistic theory, and they argue that this, the way this monistic theory was propounded by Austin and many others, are totally basically unsustainable in today's context. Now, what has happened that apart from this pluralism or the pluralistic critique which we have seen, we have also had another tradition in political theory which was associated with Karl Marx, the radical tradition, and it also launched a powerful attack on this entire concept of sovereignty. In fact, as it is well known that Marx always questioned the power of the state and state authority in the liberal capitalist societies, and for Marx the state was nothing but the instrument of the dominant class, that was the bourgeoisie, to serve its interest, the propertied class, and therefore this concept of sovereignty was also developed to basically serve the interest of this propertied class, the dominant class, and therefore in his entire scheme of things, a revolutionary society would basically dispense with this entire concept, and therefore there will be, the state will wither away, and therefore there will be no traces left of this entire sovereignty, the absolute power, the state authority, and so on and so forth. So, therefore, there is a radical powerful critique coming from this Marxian tradition, and this sovereignty is basically attacked from the point of view of the class characteristics of this entire argument. Now, apart from these theoretical philosophical debates which we have seen have taken place around this concept of sovereignty, what has happened that over the years certain developments have taken place in the world which have basically put a question mark on this viability of this concept in political theory. And one of the important development has been the advent of the nuclear weapons, and it has been argued that basically the state authority or the state power, the entire concept of sovereignty was basically visualized from the point of view of ensuring and providing security to the people. This is how Thomas Hobbes basically argued, this is how the others have argued, that security was one of the important considerations for which people basically offered habitual obedience, or basically this entire absolute power was considered most legitimate. But what has happened that this entire security has been exposed with the advent of the nuclear weapons, and the state authorities are basically totally vulnerable. They are not in a position to provide security to their own people because of, in context of the mass destructive power of this weapon, that is nuclear weapons. Then there is also another important development, that is basically the growth of international law and international organizations. You have number of international bodies which basically constrain the power and authority of nation states and their functioning, from United Nations to many other organizations like WTO, World Trade Organizations, and many such organizations which have emerged in recent years. And what has happened, that the authority and the power, the absoluteness of this nation state through which this entire concept of sovereignty is looked at is completely circumscribed and constrained, and therefore it is argued that it is no longer possible to visualize and imagine this concept of sovereignty the way Austin and other scholars or political thinkers had visualized. Now, along with all this, there is also a very important development in last 3-4 decades, and that is basically the rise of globalization. at the advent of globalization, the global global world in which the entire thing, the nation states are basically losing the earlier signs, when entire global community, the global society is considered to be one, and the nation states are considered to be subservient to this new development. Along with this globalization, you have the rise of the global civil society, you have the rise of many new social movements, and so on and so forth. So all these factors are basically moving in a direction where the authority of nation state is questioned, it is challenged, and the kind of absoluteness, the indivisibility, which were the hallmark of this concept of sovereignty, seem to be totally negotiable today. So therefore, this concept of political sovereignty over the years, the way it has evolved, has reached a new point where the new issues are emerging, new questions have to be confronted with.
Right. Thank you so much, sir. And friends, this was the theory of sovereignty. We shall be back with more as part of this series. So with this, we would like to thank sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you for being associated with us. And thank you, friends, for watching. Have a great day.